Alright, so now that we have finished Tales of the TMNT, I've done every episode of overanalyzing, and overall we've come to a conclusion about each individual episode. It's time to do an overall season ranking. So, we're going to be doing a lot of different things in this video. A lot of different factors will be applied to figure out an overall ranking for this series. First, we'll be ranking the two story arcs, the Megazord story arc and East River 3 story arc, and figuring out which story arc was better and how they stack up to general TMNT arcs from other pieces of TMNT media. And from there, we'll go into individual character breakdowns, and then from there, we'll average everything out and figure out what the average rating out of 10 for this series is. So, let's get right into it. The Megazord story arc. The Megazord story arc is definitely the better of the two story arcs throughout this entire series, in my opinion. This one feels more real and is also the one that's debatably more canon than the other one. Now, it's possible this story arc itself is also not canon, much like the East River 3 story arc, but it's a lot less blatant. It's a lot more debatable if this story arc is canon, which I think makes it a lot more canon, if that makes sense. Not to mention, the way this story arc ends, setting up Bishop teaming up with the EPF and ties to the Utrom, is a standard for the Bishop character, and for it to just not be real wouldn't make sense. It's not like the East River 3 story arc where they don't set anything up at the end. They actually set up a future for the character of Bishop in this story arc. So I think most of what happens within this story arc is canon. But regardless of how canon the story arc is, how good was it? Well, I'd actually say it was pretty solid for TMNT standards. The main plot for the story arc is about Bishop and how she was a scientist working on all kinds of funding for her robots to try and help the disabled, which is a pretty noble reason. However, the day she finally got things working correctly, the turtles came through and burned it all down, or at least that's what you saw in her eyes anyway. Due to the attack that Superfly had on New York, the turtles were kind of forced to do a lot of things to stop Superfly, and Superfly caused a lot of damage to the city. And as a result of these things that happened, and the conflict between the turtles and Superfly, it resulted in Bishop's work being destroyed, which in Bishop's eyes was the turtles directly attacking her. Obviously, the turtles didn't even acknowledge Bishop. In fact, this scene wasn't even showed in the movie whenever her work gets destroyed by the turtles. This fueled her rage and decided to make her change the reason she was building her robots from being a noble reason and building them to help the disabled and turning them into anti-mutant weapons to hunt down and destroy all mutants. However, eventually her plans fail and the turtles beat her, especially after the fact the robots turned against Bishop and started hunting down humans with biological mutations like Rod and his eye condition. There are a lot of things in the story arc that I really liked. The character development of Leo in particular is one of the best throughout this entire series. Not to mention some good character moments from Raph, Mikey, and Donnie individually throughout the series, or this story arc, add up to each of the turtles individually realizing that without each other, they're pretty much nothing, and they have no chance of beating Bishop, and that as a team, that's when they're a threat, and it can actually take down Bishop at the end. Now, there are a lot of factors that could go into them finally being able to beat Bishop at the end, but I think them being together as a team after all that time is the number one thing that made them be able to finally beat Bishop. In general, I'd give the story arc about a 6.5 out of 10. It's not anything remarkable by any means, but it's got a lot of good touches and qualities that you want in a TMNT story arc. Not to mention, the overall consistency of the story arc is very important. A lot of TMNT story arcs have a lot of filler in between the gaps. However, this story arc avoids filler very well, and everything feels like it happens for a reason or purpose, unlike the East River 3 story arc, which we'll talk about next. The East River 3 story arc. The East River 3 story arc has a lot to talk about when it comes to overall new ideas, because most of the story arc is entirely original. The East River 3 as villains are entirely original, and the return of Bad Bernie from Mutant Mayhem is an entirely original character. Now, there is some parts of this story arc that are, in fact, pulled from other pieces of TMNT media. The most notable of which would probably be the fact that you have Master Splinter becoming the Rat King. Now, Master Splinter himself becoming the Rat King isn't something that happens in any other version as far as I'm aware of, but it is something that happens in a lot of other versions where Rat King is an entirely separate character. And so having Rat King in this universe is technically canon now, or I should say not canon, since the story arc isn't canon. I like the Israel 3 a lot because they provide a lot of balance with each other. They're all very different and they're all very unique and they're likable and original characters. Plus, they give us some cool ideas for different mutants that haven't really been touched on before. It's cool to see that this version of TMNT is willing to get creative with the types of animals that get mutated. I think it's something that TMNT really struggles with and doesn't toy around with enough, aside from like the IDW comics, which is, I love the IDW comics. I really do. I really hope we get an adaptation of them someday. But regardless, this show does a good job of making some new mutant characters, that being the East River 3, that are compelling and unique in a lot of ways. Now, overall, I'd give this story arc about a 3.5 out of 10. Now, I know that sounds a little bit harsh, but the reason that this story arc is a 3.5 out of 10, even though, I mainly talked positive about it earlier in the segment before this, but this story arc being non-canon hurts it so much. Because let me paint you the picture, alright? This show only has 12 episodes, and they decided to do big story arcs that span over 6 episodes. So you get 2 story arcs, right? The Megazord story arc, which was good, and the East River 3 story arc, which was good. But they had to make the East River 3 story arc non-canon. So nothing matters. You can skip over a half of this show, and you're not missing out on anything. Like, realistically, there's no reason to watch the entire East River 3 story arc within the context of the universe. And it's really disappointing. Like, there are so many cool concepts that are wasted on a story arc that is non-canon. And for this universe, we need stuff that's canon. It has done nothing unique and nothing original. And the one time it does, it gets shot down immediately. It really sucks. And it drags down the story arc so much, to the point where I'm giving this story arc a 3.5 out of 10. And I would have given it a higher ranking than the Megazord story arc if it was canon. I love this story arc, but it not being canon hurts it so much. Okay, so now that we've ranked each individual story arc, it's time to go into individual character rankings. There are a couple of rules I'm going to have in place that I'm going to go over really quickly. First rule is that if anything happens to any character in the East River 3 story arc, it will not be taken into consideration for my character ranking. For example, any kind of character development that Pigeon Pete has in the East River 3 story arc, with him learning to talk, that's not going to be taken into consideration when giving the character ranking, since it's technically not canon. Rule number 2. I will try to avoid making comparisons when giving my rankings on any of the characters. What I mean by this is it's a commonplace in TMNT to try and compare past versions of the Turtles to newer versions of the Turtles. But I do think it's kind of unjustified to rank this series by comparing it to other Turtles when you only got 6 canon episodes for them to develop properly. So I'll try to keep this as objective as possible without comparing versions. And finally, I will not be giving character rankings to any of the Mighty Mutanimals aside from Pigeon Pete. While the Mighty Mutanimals are pretty prevalent in this series, most of the time they only really show up in the East River 3 story arc, not to mention they're not new characters. What I mean by this is I'm really only going to be giving rankings to new characters that are from this series. I kind of wanted to do this because I didn't want to repeat so many different characters. If I added all the Mutanimals to this, the duration of this video would have doubled. So we're just going to be going with characters that are new to this series, aside from the Turtles, April, and Splinter. Now that I set those rules in place, let's go ahead and jump into the individual character rankings. Leo as a character has always been the pinnacle of character development across every iteration of TMNT for this franchise, and I do think this show remains consistent with that fact. Out of all of the characters, out of all of the Turtles, Leo has the most character development, right? Throughout the entire Megazord story arc, he's constantly doubting himself, which is a slightly different take on the character. You saw glimpses of this in 2012 Leo, but most of the time when Leo doesn't have confidence in himself being a leader, it's because he thinks his team doesn't have confidence in him, which they don't. Most of the time this is depicted with his arguments with Raph, and even in 2012 at the season 2 finale when he argued with Donnie a lot, you had that whole dynamic there. But what I'm trying to get at here is most of the time, it's usually because the other turtles make Leo think that he's a bad leader. But in this version, Leo entirely convinces himself that he is a bad leader. There's nothing about him in the show that is a bad leader, at least not as far as I'm aware. He has convinced himself he's a bad leader due to his own self-doubt, and it's an interesting way to portray the character, and it actually provides a large amount of character development for them. As far as his design goes, it's pretty basic. Out of all the four turtles, he has the most basic design by far. There's not any kind of unique touches here. It's pretty much just copy-paste the 1987 design, but you make him just as wide as the 2003 Leo was. But all in all, I'd give this version of Leo about a 7 out of 10. This version of Leo is really good, and I would give him a higher ranking, but I can't really justify it when, if I gave him a higher ranking, he'd be on par with 2003 and 2012 Leo, and to say that this version of Leo is on par with those two versions of Leo after just 6 episodes is a bit ludicrous. So he'll stay around this 7 out of 10 ranking for now, but as this universe progresses, he could definitely be up there as one of the best Leos in terms of overall character development. Alright, next up we have Donnie, and I will try to remain as unbiased as possible here because Donnie is my favorite of the four turtles. So I might be a little biased when it comes to his ranking, but I think he's probably the second best turtle in this version. Like, objectively, he seems very likable and enjoyable. He has a lot of good, compassionate moments. He's very smart, but this series also sheds light on the nerdy side of Donnie, which I really like. It's not something that's talked about a lot in TMNT, but seeing it be such a big part of this series and Donnie's character throughout it is very, very nice. And his design is actually pretty unique for Donnie standards. He has some glasses, which is reminiscent of the Michael Bay Turtles, which, being reminiscent of the Michael Bay Turtles might not exactly be a good thing, but I think the glasses work here. He's got his fanny pack, too, and in general, his voice and stuff is really squeaky, like a teenage boy. It works. I really like this design for Donnie. It's unique. It's original. It stays true to the character while shedding some light on some other aspects of the character. So I'd give this version of Donnie about like a 6 out of 10. I really enjoy this version of Donnie. Once again, the only reason he's not any higher is because saying he's just as good as other versions of Donnie in such a short amount of time is kind of unjustified in my opinion, and that's kind of good to be the sentiment I'm going forward under. Alright, next up is Mikey, and across all versions of TMNT, Mikey's probably the most consistent in the terms of the way he's portrayed. Even in Rise, which is a show entirely about deviating from what TMNT's common standards are, Mikey's character stays relatively the same, and I think that's pretty good. Mikey is often depicted as the most popular of the turtles, not even just within the universes that the shows take place, but outside of universe, Mikey's definitely the most popular turtle. Like, if you ask anyone who their favorite turtle is, most of the time they're going to say Mikey. That's just kind of a given. But as far as his actual character development throughout the series, he actually has some pretty good character moments for Mikey's standards. One, there's a lot of moral implications and everything that happens with him and Rod. Rod wanting to become a mutant, Mikey has to try and work around, is making Rod become a mutant the best way about getting what he needs in the terms of helping his brothers? Can he compromise his own moral implications, knowing that turning Rod into a mutant is going to end badly just to save his brothers? And eventually Mikey does make the right decision, but this ends up creating Pigeon Pete, which is another argument I'd like to bring up. Mikey's technically a father in this version. Technically, Pigeon Pete has Mikey's biological DNA within him. So, technically, Mikey's a father in this version, and I think that's kind of funny to think about. But as far as Mikey's design goes, he's very square in this version. His head is square, and he's very boxy around the shell, more so than the other turtles are. He's definitely the shortest and smallest of the turtles, which is consistent with the way Mikey's normally portrayed, and he has braces, which is pretty cool. With this version of the TMNT trying to keep them within their teenager identity, that's part of the turtles that's not really focused on a lot, Giving them braces is something a lot of teenagers go through, so it makes sense that the turtles would have some braces too, and in this case it would be Mikey. Overall, I'd give this version of Mikey about a 5 out of 10. This version of Mikey doesn't really have anything unique about him. He's very standard for the overall portrayal of this character and how things normally go. There's not anything that differentiates him from any other version of the character, and overall, he's just an average version of the character, so he's going to get an average ranking, that being 5 out of 10. It's not like any of the other versions where having a lack of things to pull from really affects the ranking here. I mean, you could make an argument that it does, but in general, this version of Mikey just doesn't really have anything special for me to say about him to justify giving him a high ranking. Now we move on to the last one of the turtles, that being Raph, and I think Raph overall is the weakest portrayal out of all the turtles in this series. Now, I couldn't really tell you why. My best guess would be that he doesn't really have a lot going on. There's not any depth to his character, he's not making any kind of funny references or jokes. He kind of just doesn't really do anything. Now, I don't think it's entirely to Raph's detriment. I don't think he gets a lot of opportunities to do anything throughout this series. You have everything between him and the Purple Dragons and stuff, which is an interesting dynamic, but that episode of his is more interesting because it has the Purple Dragons in it, and it doesn't really have anything to do with Raph. That's not why people like the episode. It's because the Purple Dragons are in it. Now, he does have some good moments throughout this series, but most of them aren't really kind of in detail or add character depth in any way. They're just there. They're like, haha, good moment with the character, and that's it. This version of Raph is pretty in character. He's mean, he's slouchy, he does whatever he wants. And if you got a problem with it, he's got a problem with you. That whole attitude, he's kind of still like that. It's not really hammered down as much, but he's still the most aggro of the bunch. And then you have his design, which is very reminiscent of Raph's design. He's very big, very bulky, the bulkiest out of all the turtles. He's got that pirate-style bandana. He has like a little missing tooth in there too, as well. He's got some kind of unique parts about his design, but kind of like Leo, there's not much unique about him, and I think he kind of struggles with that. I think overall, this version of Raph only really gets about a 4 out of 10 from me. I think this version of Raph isn't innovative. It's not trying to be anything. It's not. He's just there. And I feel like, unlike Mikey in this version, I said a similar thing about him, but I feel like Raph struggles with this more because Raph is a character that's all up in your face, and he's just not like that in your version. He doesn't do anything that catches your attention, and it really struggles, and it really is to the detriment of Raph in this series. Next up, we move on to April, and April is kind of a curious case in this version. She definitely returns to her roots as a character in being a news reporter. All the way back in 1987 was the first time we ever saw this, and it was kind of the last time we ever saw it, too. 2003 returned to April and how she was portrayed in the comics, and then 2012 did something completely different, and ever since then, we just have continuously had different versions of the character. But it's good to see the OG news reporter style of the character return. Now, she does have elements of other versions of April mixed in as well. For example, she's actually around the turtle's age and goes to school, much like 2012 April. And Rise, you can see elements of her design, most notably her being a black character, which is good. I think TMNT needs more black characters, to be honest with you. The only recurring black character in TMNT is Baxter Stockman, and he's a villain. So having a good guy black character that black kids can look up to would be a very good idea, and changing April to be a black character is a way to do that. Now, in general, I think I'd give this version of April about a 5 out of 10. She doesn't really contribute much in this version, which is a problem with the character itself, and not necessarily a problem with this version of the character. She's kind of just there to be the damsel in distress and the female character to throw in some diversity as far as gender goes. 2012 was really the only version that ever made her feel like a worthy part of the team, and that was because she had psychic, telekinetic abilities, so I don't necessarily think you can call that a reasonable thing to compare that version of April to this one, but in general, this version of April is okay, and a lot of problems with the character are the main reason she's so low. Next up is Master Splinter, and Master Splinter in this version is extremely reminiscent of the Rise version of Splinter. His design is similar, he's short, he's kind of fat, and his overall characteristics are also very similar. He doesn't really train the turtles that much. Like, realistically, like, there ain't no way teaching them how to fight from Jackie Chan movies is really good enough to make them full-on ninjas. Which is still better than Rise Splinter ever did. Rise Splinter just never did anything with them. Speaking of Rise Splinter kind of has a lot of ties to TV, like he used to be a former TV star, and in this version, Splinter teaches the turtles to fight from Jackie Chan movies, so there's some connections there. Like I said, the design is very similar. He'd rather sit at home and do nothing the entire time the Megazord story arc is happening than go out there and help them. I mean, like, in general, this version of Splinter just doesn't really invoke much confidence for the character. And if I'm going to be honest with you, I'm giving this version of Splinter a 3 out of 10. And, like, I just don't like this version of Splinter because it's just too reminiscent of the Rise version of Splinter. And I hate Rise Splinter. Like, that guy was an absolute deadbeat father to the minimum. So, this is where this version of Splinter is going to go, and maybe he'll get some character development in future iterations of this franchise. But this is not a good start for this version of Splinter, I'm not going to lie. Alright, now we move on to Bishop, who was the main antagonist for this story arc, and oh boy, did they change a lot about this character. For starters, it's a girl now, which is completely fine. Gender swaps happened quite a bit in this version, so seeing Bishop gender swap isn't really a problem. Then you also have the main elephant in the room for me, and that's the fact that this version of Bishop does not appear to be an Utrom at all. She appears to just be a normal human being who has nothing to do with the Utrom. Or at least, not yet, because it looked like they were setting her up to have ties to the EPF, and if we know anything about the EPF, it's that they are heavily tied to the Utrom, especially because it's been heavily teased that they are part of the Utrom. As far as Bishop's individual character development goes, though, she doesn't really have a lot of it. Her journey starts where she's building her Megazord to try and help the disabled, most notably her sister, who was born without her legs. But eventually, when everything happens between Superfly and the Turtles in New York at the end of the first movie, you actually had her lab get destroyed with all of her robots. So then Bishop vows to use her robots to destroy all mutants. She does all this with the funding of Rod's dad, speaking of which, Rod is her assistant alongside her. He doesn't really contribute much, but, he's there. And then eventually they go down this wild goose chase that eventually ends in Bishop realizing that her robots aren't exactly the best in terms of safety for the world, so she helps the turtles take them down. But then all that character development gets backpedaled because she decides to join the EPF because she gets an offer from them at the end of the final episode of the Megazord story arc. And as far as her design goes, her design is pretty basic. Like I said, she is a female character now. She does appear to have some kind of cybernetic arm. And she's kind of short. She's got gray hair. She's kind of portrayed as an older person, maybe more middle-aged. But there's not really much else to talk about for the design after that. And, in general, I'd give this version of Bishop about a 6.5 out of 10. She's not really anything special, but she's entirely new take on the character, and it's executed pretty well, all things considered. But I do think I want to see more of this character and how their ties to the EPF are going to work, especially since they themselves are not an Utrom. Next up is Rod, and Rod is rather peculiar because he's very reminiscent of a TMNT 2012 character. And if you watch the original Overanalyzing episode with him in it, you'll know that I'm referencing Timothy here. Timothy was his character originally introduced in the TMNT 2012 series, however, it's entirely possible he was inspired by Ralph the Fifth Turtle from the original 87 series. And basically, he was kind of like a vigilante guy who really looked up to the Turtles and knew about them and wanted to be exactly like them, to the point where he wanted to go on and become a mutant himself to try and fight crime alongside them, which is something very similar to what Rod wants here. Now, Rod is a little bit different. He just seems to like mutants in general, and it's not really a fascination with the Turtles specifically. But it is definitely interesting to see, and if any part of what I think might happen with Rod is true, his character development is going to be very interesting, and he's going to have a very interesting dynamic with the Turtles going forward. But as for what we have right now, his character development was kind of non-existent. He starts out being Bishop's assistant, and then decides to team up with Mikey, and he doesn't really turn back after that. It entirely seems like he just wanted to become a mutant, and that's why he teamed up with Mikey, But still, I do think it's interesting to see that that's the route he went down personally. As for his design, there's not really much to talk about. He's a fat ginger guy. Um, he's got some funny moments. He's got decent chemistry with Mikey. And overall, I'd probably give Rod about a 4.5 out of 10. He's not really anything special throughout this series, but I think everything that set him up to be in the future could make for a very interesting dynamic, especially if they go down the route of making him more like Timothy. Next up is Pigeon Pete, and for the first time since 2012, we will have the return of Pigeon Pete. Pigeon Pete, as far as I'm aware, was a character introduced in 2012 and was kind of only relevant in certain comics up until recently with this series. Now, Pigeon Pete's origin in this is far different. First of all, he's actually technically the child of Mikey, like I mentioned earlier. It's not really anything super important. It's more so a funny thing I noticed that I thought I'd mention, but I do think it's kind of cool in a way. Number two, he does not talk at all. Because you remember, like I said, I'm not including anything that happens in the East River 3 story arc since it's established to be non-canon or heavily implied at the end of the series. So it will not be taken into consideration. So Pigeon Pete doesn't talk in this version. He's kind of useless. He just creates problems with the turtles, but he's a good laugh, and he does end up being the MVP at the end by setting off the EMP. So all in all, I think Pigeon Pete has to get a ranking of about a 5 out of 10. He's not exactly anything special, but he did contribute more than a lot of other characters did, so this got to count for something. Now it's time to move on to the final character I will be giving an individual review for, and that's going to be Metalhead. And oh boy, it's been a while since we've seen him too. Much like Pigeon Pete, his last appearance aside from comics and video games was the 2012 TV series. Now, you did have Sheldon in Rise, but that's a different name and an entirely different character and concept of a character. He just also happens to be a robot, so I don't think they can be counted as the same character there. So, it's definitely cool to see Metalhead return. I think he's portrayed very well in this version. I really like this version of Metalhead. I like his design. It's kind of very reminiscent of the Mechazoids. After all, that's how Donnie made him, was like taking a Mechazoid he had taken down and transforming it and recoding it into Metalhead, which is a very unique way to do Metalhead. I think it works within the context of the universe. It's very good. And then you have his personality, which most of the time Metalhead doesn't talk or have a personality at all. But this version of Metalhead does. And he's so funny and chill. And I just love this version of Metalhead so much. We got such a short amount of time with him, but he contributed a lot too, kind of like Pigeon Pete. Like at the end there, he was kind of the MVP. And, he does end up getting destroyed by the end, but Mikey does mention that they can just rebuild him because he's a robot. So that it does imply that they will rebuild him at some point, and he'll come into play in later episodes. But overall, I really love this version of Metalhead, man. I'm going to give him like a 7 out of 10. I really love this version of Metalhead, and the only reason I'm not giving him any higher ranking is simply because we didn't get a lot of time with him. If we got more time with them, I'd be putting him a lot higher here. Now that we've ranked both of the individual story arcs and all the individual characters, it's time to give a overall series ranking. The way I'm going to be doing this is getting the average of the story arc rankings and the average of individual character rankings, and we will be merging them and figuring out what the average is. Now, the average of all 10 character rankings is 5.3, and the average for the story arc rankings is 5.1. And with that average story arc ranking of 5.1 compared to the individual character ranking of 5.3, that's going to give us an average series ranking of about a 5 out of 10, which I think reflects this series entirely well. I think this series is painfully mediocre. It does not excel at anything, and it does not struggle at anything. It accomplished what it was trying to accomplish, and that's it. There's not really a lot of good qualities in the show, but there's not a lot of bad qualities either. It's just okay at best, and I think that is the perfect way to sum up the series. Now, I do think it's a little unfair to compare this series to past versions of TMNT, because we only really got 6 canon episodes. This series was a lot shorter for TMNT series standards, and not to mention only half the episodes were canon. So this series kind of struggles from a number of those factors, and I think comparing it to past versions of TMNT isn't really justified. But I do think it's reasonable to have some concern that if this is how this universe is going to go going forward, it's going to continue being average at best, and it's not really going to provide any good new material for the franchise, and it's going to be very worrying because it looks like Nickelodeon wants to go all in on this version of the Turtle specifically. Hey, it's me, Outro Turtleman here, and I just wanted to say a big thank you for stopping by and watching this video. It took me a really long time to watch this video, so any amount of support you show to it or this channel will be very much appreciated. But also, I wanted to give you guys a little heads up, simply because I have some things going on. With the holidays coming up and the overall direction of this channel shifting a little bit, I'm going to be taking a break for the holidays. I hope you have a happy holidays, and it's going to be a while before I'm back. Expect the next Overanalyzing TMNT series to start up sometime around January next year. So I might upload some other videos in between now and then. I'm not going to be completely vacant either. I will be working on videos while I'm on break. But I just wanted to give you guys a heads up so you're not completely blindsided by me not uploading for a while. But I'll be sure to let you guys know whenever I'm coming back in a community post. I really appreciate all the support I've had in the recent months, and I can't wait to see where this YouTube journey takes me going forward. So, until I see you in January, bye-bye.